Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. We will be covering really some of the best practices and different ways of completing a successful remote HAZOP. So thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to the presentation. Just a little bit of background on this presentation. We're all seeing really the profound impact that the COVID-19 virus, is having all around the world and affecting so many different people. So the first thing is this at exida that we hope that everyone is staying safe, following government, guidelines for social distancing and other activities. And we really hope that just that, everyone is healthy and well through this difficult time. Um, and so in addition to kind of just the overall challenges that we're seeing, particularly in the engineering sector for all of these large facilities, we've seen a really drastic increase in requests for remote HAZOPs and other remote activities just because there's still a lot of important work that needs to be done, but still following these guidelines. And so we thought that this was something that was really important to present, very timely. And so we really wanted to walk through what we see as some of the most important steps for completing successful remote HAZOP studies. This isn't something where there's brand new technology that allows us to do it, but it's really understanding with the current technology and the current need, the best way to go through and complete those HAZOPs. And so when we go through the presentation, we'll look at things like considerations for the HAZOP team, for the meeting technology, the structure of the meeting, and also things that can be done to prepare ahead of the meeting. And look at how, when we take all of these things and put them together, that we can actually get a really robust, really successful HAZOP study, but actually complete it remotely. And so we hope that everyone will find this to be useful information. The audio that we're using is going to be through the GoToWebinar application. So please, if you're listening in, you haven't heard anything yet, or as we start switching through the slides, please don't hesitate to ask any questions. We have a couple um, administrators on the line, so if anything goes in the questions tool, we can help with that. Also, as we go throughout the presentation, please don't hesitate to use the questions tool to ask any questions about the content that's being presented, if there's anything that you want to dive a little bit deeper onto. And so, with that, we'll kick off into the intro. Um, just a little bit about myself. My name is Patrick O'Brien, and I am a safety and cybersecurity engineer at exida. I've been working here for a little bit over 3 years now. My background is in chemical engineering, and I studied at Penn State University. And so with that background, I started off focusing very much mainly on the process safety aspects, doing lots of HAZOPs. Over time, that kind of naturally transitioned into also covering some cybersecurity, doing cybersecurity risk assessment. And so the techniques that we'll look at here are focused mainly on HAZOPs, but we will talk about that there are a lot of other activities that can be done following this same approach. Um, just a real brief background on exida, we really are a customer-focused company, and our goal is always to help our customers achieve safe, secure, and reliable solutions, and there are 3 main ways in which we do that. The first are our enterprise tools, and so thinking about Excelentia or some of our OEM tools as well, we're using these tools just internally at first, and then realized that there was actually a need in a market to develop and sell those tools as well. So we can talk through how having the right tools can also be a helpful method of going through and doing the remote HAZOP studies. We can also talk about our certification and assessment. So we are an accredited body to go through and do certification for both functional safety and cybersecurity activities. And then lastly, really where our HAZOPs fit mostly would be our lifecycle services. So really going through and tackling those tough automation problems. In the webinar today, we're going to focus on 3 main parts. And so the first will be looking at the importance of HAZOP studies and while there really is the need to continue to complete them and look at moving to a remote method for completing the HAZOP studies. Next, we'll look at the best practices for conducting remote HAZOPs and to really dive into the steps for completing a successful remote HAZOP, what sort of things need to be, thought through and considered. And then lastly, we'll look at, what are the benefits of doing the remote HAZOP? Why is it, important to go through and do now, and what sort of benefits can be seen by following that approach? Um, so to start off, for the importance of HAZOP studies, um, if anyone, clicked into the link today without, having a full background on HAZOP, you're very brave. It's always an acronym that is a little bit scary. So we'll just talk through, real briefly, what is a HAZOP? It stands for HAZard and Operability Study, and it's really a method for systematically analyzing process P&IDs. And really, we're going through, looking at a predefined list of deviations or guide words, and looking at how, there are things in the process that could cause us to, deviate from normal operations, and then really understanding what the consequence is. Um, and when we're doing HAZOP, it's really important to understand that we're developing the full chain of consequences. So it's not looking at, what the impact of any safeguards would be initially. It's not thinking about just what's the next thing that happens. It's really building out that full worst case scenario of, if this valve closes, do we have an overpressure? Is that overpressure a rupture? And really taking that all the way to the point of closure. And so once that consequence is defined, we can then look at safeguards. So what things are in place? It could be anything from a pressure relief valve to a safety instrumented function, and looking at how those protections will reduce the likelihood or reduce the consequence severity if it's more of a mitigating safeguard. And so as we go through that, we're continuing to rank the scenarios based off of predefined risk criteria. And if we get to a place where there is high risk, we can then make recommendations to reduce that if applicable. And kind of as the name implies, a HAZOP study looks at both safety and operational issues. So there, is pretty much a broad scope of what could be considered in terms of the different risks, and it can have, a big impact in addressing and mitigating those risks. If we think about, the timeframes when a HAZOP is needed, it's applicable to both greenfield and brownfield facilities. And so as we're going through, if we think about in the project phase of a facility when it's being designed and then built, the HAZOP is a really important part of that analysis. If you think about kind of a stage gate methodology or, however the project progresses, HAZOP is typically a pretty big hurdle to cross. And once you get to that point, it really is a big milestone for the project. Another thing to think about is that during the project phase, there also might be multiple times at which a HAZOP or other risk assessment technique is conducted. A lot of times initial HAZOPs may be done by the equipment providers themselves to get an understanding of if there need to be safeguards in place or everything going into the full client HAZOP. And so really understanding when that HAZOP fits as part of the greenfield is important, and it's good to know that that is something that needs to be watched and fit into the project timeline. And then for brownfield facilities, so once the facility has been built, it's now put into service, the HAZOP needs to be periodically revalidated to make sure that adequate protections are still in place and to make sure that, if any major changes haven't been caught yet, that those are considered and looked at in the risk assessment. And the typical time frame is really not to exceed 5 years on that. That fits into the OSHA PSM requirements, and many facilities just see that as a typical revalidation time frame. And then the last reason to look at doing a HAZOP would be management of change. So looking at any changes that have a potential to impact the safety system or the control that are going to have an impact on risk, there's really a requirement to go back to the safety life cycle, look at the first steps that is impacted, and then really run through to make sure that the risk hasn't been impacted in a negative way. And so if we think about all three of those reasons, or timeframes is why a HAZOP might be critical to complete now during this social distancing time. And so as we go through, we'll look at, how can, this method support those timeframes. And then lastly, what we want to look at for the HAZOP, background is why go through and conduct a HAZOP study. And so, the first couple bullet points maybe are why you must conduct a HAZOP study. And then the last one we'll talk through is really more of a why you should conduct a HAZOP study, and really where the benefits are for all of the parties doing that study. And so in many places, the completion of a HAZOP study or similar risk assessment is actually a legal or regulatory requirement. So, you may not be able to start up and run your facility if that HAZOP is not completed. For OSHA PSM, the HAZOP must be revalidated on that set time frame, not to exceed 5 years. And then additionally, in the US where some of the requirements are not as much legislation driven, there's an insurance requirement. So even facilities that don't fall under OSHA PSM, they have a requirement to go through and conduct those HAZOP studies. And we've actually been called into facilities before where kind of the initiating event or really the precipice for calling us was that their insurance was not accepting the previously done HAZOP report, that they needed help to kind of show what they're doing for risk mitigation. And so a lot of those really are driving factors for going through and completing these HAZOP studies. Kind of then stepping down from that, a lot of times it can also be looked at as a project requirement. So an owner operator may not accept a facility or a system unless they are able to see the HAZOP report to see that there's adequate risk reduction. And so all of those things that really drive why a HAZOP needs to be done in a set time frame. And then lastly, really the overall goal of the HAZOP and why it's so important is that it offers a method for identifying critical safety and operability concerns. And so this is where, it's a really good opportunity to make the system inherently safer, or, if as much inherent safety is in there as possible, then looking at, what are the most important safeguards, what sort of, requirements are there for those safeguards. And that just is really the important first step in going through and doing the rest of the safety life cycle. So for all of those reasons, the HAZOP is really a crucial piece both for large projects as well as operating facilities, with a lot of different stakeholders interested in those results. So when we think about that, when we think about how important these HAZOP studies are, and think about everything that's going on right now, remote HAZOPs really have become a very important topic. And so what we're going to then talk about really for the meat of this presentation is, what are some best practices for conducting remote HAZOPs? And really looking at, what are the steps to conducting a successful remote HAZOP? If we've got the goal of that, complete, well-documented HAZOP report, what are, the steps? How are we going to, climb that mountain? Especially, considering not just the complexity of the material, but now that has to be done remotely. And so we're going to talk about what we see are kind of 4 of the keys to a successful remote HAZOP. The first bullet that we'll look at will be our meeting preparation. We'll talk about all of the things that are important to do before starting the HAZOP. Then we'll look at the makeup of the HAZOP team and what sort of considerations to think about when putting the team together. We'll look at the meeting technology and then also the meeting structure to understand the different types of remote HAZOPs that may be needed. In terms of preparing for the remote HAZOP, what we've seen are some of the most important things are to outline the rules of the road for the HAZOP study ahead of time. So defining the formal scope of what's going to be looked at during the sessions, identifying what guide words are going to be used, identifying the risk matrix and risk criteria that will be used, and making sure that is shared with all of the participants ahead of time. A lot of times what we'll do on larger HAZOP projects is actually develop what's called a terms of reference. And it really pulls all this information together and would give participants one location where they can go to look at what the guide words will be, look at what the specific scope being covered is, as well as having access to that risk matrix and the noted PNIDs and what references are being used. And so Sometimes if you're in person, if everyone's in the same room, you have a little bit more flexibility where, you can start handing out some paper copies, or if it's not available at the start of the meeting, someone can, run and grab it. When you're looking at a remote session, really anything you can do to get everyone on the same page ahead of time, and limit distractions as you go through on the call is really critical, and really makes a big difference in terms of the success of the study. Another thing that's particularly important for remote HAZOPs is actually going through and noting the PNIDs ahead of time. And so in the HAZOP method, we will split equipment and piping up into individual nodes. That gives us smaller sections to run our guide words, and make sure that we're not overlooking anything when we're going through and reviewing that equipment. And so for a normal HAZOP study, that's something where it can either be done, in the room using highlighters or markers or colored pencils, kind of whatever method works best for the facilitator, or, it can still be done ahead of time for in-person meetings. But what we've seen is for remote HAZOPs, having that discussion with the process engineers up front, going through and breaking out those nodes and having them, ready to go at the start of the meeting, is so important, because then those can be sent out and everyone has access to the nodes. So if you're on node 1, everyone knows exactly what node 1 means. And we've seen that have a very big impact on how successful the studies are. And then so, really then the last step is, after you've gone through and done those preparation activities, just making sure that all of the participants have access, that they've got the risk matrix, the noted PNIDs, cause and effects, and any other reference material that's going to be important to look at for that HAZOP study. And so really, by doing those things ahead of time, you can really set yourself up for success before even starting the remote HAZOP session. The next thing to think about are, the HAZOP team members. And so, what's important for the facilitator, the scribes, and then also the subject matter experts that are going to be on that call. And so really looking at putting the team together, for remote HAZOPs, we certainly recommend having both a facilitator and a scribe. And we'll talk about a little bit later why that's so important. But just to cover kind of the roles and what those team members will do. So the facilitator, isn't necessarily an expert on the specific technology being looked at, but they need to be familiar enough to, ask the right questions of the subject matter experts, and they must be, very much an expert on the HAZOP methodology for actually leading the group through those guide words. The scribe, really has got to have the best ears on the team. They're listening to all of the discussion going on, and then they're responsible for capturing that in the PHA worksheet. And so those, would be kind of the members coming in to lead the HAZOP team. And then the subject matter experts are, the group who really have the process knowledge, who understand the facility, and are able to answer those detailed questions to dive down to understand, what those consequences would be, what the safeguards are. And so the critical roles for HAZOP are always operations. For an operating facility, operators who are out there who see the facility, they really are the best resource you can have. A knowledgeable operator in a HAZOP makes all the difference. Process engineers are also very important. Instrumentation and controls for understanding of the different safeguard setup, or how the control philosophy is implemented. Looking at process safety or environmental health and safety, that's another important role to see at the HAZOPs. And then for mechanical and commissioning, kind of as needed based on the specific systems that's looking at and the complexity of the tasks. So for example, for any sort of rotating equipment, your mechanical engineer is going to be your go-to guy on any of that mechanical side. Or if you're in the project phase, sometimes commissioning can be very important for understanding, when you run the units for the first time, or when you're actually, starting up for that initial run of the unit. So understanding, what team members need to be present is another important thing of setting the meeting up for success. Some best practices that we've seen in terms of team considerations are really making sure that the facilitator is not only an expert in the HAZOP methodology, but that they're also familiar with the remote technology being used. Really having some experience running through or at least watching a remote HAZOP before can make a big difference, and it really helps them to go smoother in the future. Um, Kind of as we talked about, for remote HAZOPs, a scribe is something that we would strongly recommend considering. Um, for any complex systems, it's really almost a necessity because there's so much going on there. There's so much technical depth there that it's hard enough to get everyone on the same page, even if you're in the same room, can watch everyone and talk. For the remote HAZOP, being able to have that second set of ears listening in, to be able to let the facilitator and scribe kind of focus on different parts of the conversation or dive in on different parts, that makes a really big difference in the overall understanding and the overall quality of the study completed. Another thing that we would say is really try to keep the HAZOP team as small as possible. Um, sometimes guidelines for an operating facility would be try to keep it between 6 to 8 participants. Sometimes on projects, that's really not an achievable goal. I've been on ones that are, over 30 people. And sometimes, you're able to get through a little bit of the big group in person because you can kind of see who the contributors are and, work with the group that really is providing the information. But sometimes on a remote call, with the more people that are on, it can be really difficult to, hear who's talking or, get through the discussion and kind of get to the important information. So certainly keeping in mind, limiting the team size would be a big recommendation for remote HAZOPs. And then the last consideration is this is something that is so important when going through and doing a remote HAZOP, is making sure that the team is familiar with a HAZOP method. A lot of times when we're doing an in-person HAZOP, if it's our first time working with that customer, we kind of spend, the first 2 to 4 hours of the day really diving in on the HAZOP method. It's almost part training, part HAZOP analysis to really get the team understanding of the method and to really get that deep understanding of why we're going through and following the guide words in a specific way. And so if that is something that, can either be done ahead of time with the team, so doing a couple prep meetings to make sure that everyone who's going to be involved in the HAZOP is trained on the method ahead of time, that can be a big difference. Or another thing would be just working with a team who is very familiar with the method, who understands going through and doing, unmitigated consequence first and can really follow through. That's going to be something that has a major impact on how successful the study is. When we think about the technology then for the remote HAZOP, this is something that really is specific to the remote meetings and can have a major impact on the quality. So one thing would be, if possible, use headsets. Um, there are definitely a lot of good options out there, and they can really have a major upgrade in terms of the audio quality. And when there are so many different people on the call, trying to understand, what's going on in the process is hard enough. Any other barriers or feedback or anything that makes that more difficult just lessens the effectiveness of the study. Um, Another thing is considering what sort of internet access is available. Are the participants all calling in from home, or are they all located on a site? I know sometimes at operating facilities, the internet access can be tricky, just depending on the network infrastructure around there. So thinking about where the best location is to have that good internet connection to allow for kind of good meeting quality, all of that can really have an impact on how quickly the team gets fatigued and how much information is able to be covered on the study. Another, technology feature that's kind of, use it or don't use it, it can really go either way, would be thinking about things like webcams. What we've seen is if it's really a remote facilitation team and then the participants, are all still together, essential personnel at an operating facility where they're, still going into work, we have seen benefits in using a webcam. And essentially, it would be one webcam to allow them to see the facilitator, and another to show the room. So that way, the facilitator is able to read a little bit of body language. He can see, who's talking or who, has more to add to a certain point. And so we've seen that to be, a really good way of doing it. When we think about where everyone's remote and calling in, though, we have, for some meetings we've tried to use the webcams just to see if that makes people feel more involved in the process. But we've actually seen that, if everyone has their own screen, it can be a little bit more distracting trying to focus in on each of the different webcams. Um, so I think that one, really depends on the structure of the meeting, and then the comfort level of the team is something that can, either help or potentially um, not help as much in terms of the meeting effectiveness. Another thing for the technology of the meeting is make sure that you can use 2 meeting screens. This is something that we've rolled out recently as kind of a requirement for when we're doing these remote HAZOP sessions. And we've seen it to kind of make all the difference in the world. This is, if there was one thing to take away, it was really understanding that having 2 screens makes a major impact on a remote study. And really, the benefit of having 2 screens is that one screen can always be focused on the PHA worksheet. And so on our screen here, we're showing the Excellentia tool, which is what we, when we're going through and doing HAZOPs, that's what we recommend. So you can always look at that HAZOP worksheet. Everyone can be reading, what the cause consequence is. They can have clear visibility of what the discussion is about. And then on the second screen, you can share the noted PNIDs, and in that way, then everyone will have, be on the same page, not only literally, but also figuratively. Keeping everyone on the same discussion point, is hard enough in a regular HAZOP. So anything you can do to keep the group together on the same page for a remote HAZOP has a major, major impact. And so by doing that, the facilitator can actually, kind of similar to what I'm doing now, walk through and talk about, hey, when we talk about this valve closing, what's the impact going to be on the upstream equipment? What's the impact on the downstream equipment? It really just helps to frame that discussion, and that's something that helps us to more closely mirror what's done in an in-person HAZOP. So making sure that the participants have the ability to view 2 screens, or if they're in a room, make sure that that room has 2 clearly visible screens. That's something that really makes a major impact on the success of the study. And so then that kind of leads us into the meeting structure. And so thinking about, the time of the meeting, as well as, the meeting location. So what we've seen is it is possible to conduct a full 8-hour HAZOP study remotely. I think I've actually even got up to a 9 or 10-hour one, which was certainly by the end of it was getting to be, too much for everyone. But the kind of the takeaway is that you can do a full 8-hour HAZOP study if it's, something that's being dictated by the project schedule or the time frame, it needs to be done that quickly. But what we've seen is it can really lead to increased team fatigue. An 8-hour HAZOP day in person is tiring enough. And if you go through and do, multiple weeks of that, you certainly start to see the team lose focus just because it's so complex to be looking at for so long. And what we've seen is for the remote studies, I would say that the fatigue factor does happen a little bit more quickly even, just because it is difficult to pay attention to the screen for that long, and to try to just, listen and understand what's going on. So what we would recommend is if timing allows, consider breaking the HAZOP up into 4-hour sessions. Tackling that in a half day not only helps prevent the team from fatiguing if you have a lot of sessions to cover, but then it also allows them to keep working on other projects and just find a little bit of better balance between the HAZOP and other activities. So that's something where, if timing allows, we would strongly recommend that for remote HAZOPs. And then regardless of the meeting time, whether it's a full day or half day, taking frequent breaks, making sure that people are able to get up, stretch around, and just take a break from looking at the screen really makes a big difference. Giving everyone enough time for their lunch or dinner, and really, making sure that people feel like they're still able to have a normal day when they're going through and doing the HAZOP. Um, we can also talk about thinking about when you've got lots of different groups who are now calling in from different time zones. It's not uncommon for in-person HAZOPs to, have vendors flying in from across the globe during the project phase for these big projects. And so understanding that, since that's no longer possible for the current time, how are you able to, communicate with them and, keep on the same page and really have successful meetings with that. And so figuring out the timing that works best for all of the time zones, being able to line up breaks effectively, that's something that makes a major difference. Some of the HAZOP studies that I've been doing remotely recently, we've had participants from Europe, from India, as well as participants from different time zones across the US. So there definitely can be a lot of complexity in trying to figure out the optimal time for everyone. But doing a little work ahead of time and understanding, you know, maybe you only do the 4-hour sessions and you always do them in the morning so that people in other parts of the world can join. That's something that we've certainly seen and have done successfully. And then kind of as we talked about a little bit for the webcam use is, if it is an operating facility and most of the participants are in one location, make sure that that room has the ability to have 2 clearly visible screens. And that's something that we, would always request if we're going on site to do a HAZOP anyway, just to make sure that the P&IDs can be on one screen and the PHA worksheet can be on another. And so going through and making sure that that's the case for these remote meetings is also still very important, and something that has a major impact on the success of the study. So then lastly, what we'll talk through before jumping to some of the questions would be looking at the benefits of a remote HAZOP study. So, we've looked at why studies are important, but now let's think about, why is it important to maybe go through and get some of these HAZOP studies done now? What are the benefits of the remote approach? So the first benefits, and kind of a lot of times the impetus on the, this must be done now, it's kind of time critical, would be that, any sort of existing project schedule time frame or deadline, or also then a current or validation timeframe or deadline. When there are those requirements coming up and you're kind of pushed for time, being able to go through and do the remote HAZOP to stay on that schedule is going to have a really major impact. And so that's kind of just the general of, some of the benefits of still being able to go through and complete these activities now. Then when we think of the benefits just overall from the approach of the HAZOP study is that it reduces the cost of the HAZOP study. So there's for example, if you are hiring a third party to come in and do it, you no longer have the cost of that travel time. You don't have the travel and living expenses, and it also then would limit the travel for the attendees of the HAZOP. It's not uncommon for people to be flying in from all around the country and all around the globe just to attend HAZOPs. And so by doing it remotely, you can significantly reduce the overall cost impact of holding a HAZOP study. And then the last benefit, and what really the most important part of this is, if you go through with the preparation, if you kind of follow some set guidelines, you get into a good routine, you can still get the same rigor of analysis for the HAZOP study as you would with a traditional in-person HAZOP. And that's what's so important. Going through and kind of getting a rigorous analysis of the, process information, going through all of those P&IDs in detail is something that's not easy. But kind of following these guidelines and some of these best practices, you're still able to get to that same level of a successfully completed HAZOP remotely. And that's really what it's all about, is making sure that the steps to reduce the safety risk as well as operability concerns are successfully implemented. Another thing we can talk about when we think about the benefits of the approach is this something that we could only do for HAZOP? We talk through some of the very specific things that we would recommend going through and doing ahead of a HAZOP study, But following those same principles, you can actually see lots of other successful activities. So for many of the other safety lifecycle tasks, a lot of these might be done remotely anyway. But thinking about things like LOPA or any sort of functional safety management plan discussion, or SIL verification, anything like that, following this same approach where you're able to have multiple pieces of information shared, whether it's whatever program you're using to do the SIL verification and then the detailed engineering documents, but being able to share both of those at the same time really helps pull everyone's focus together and allows everyone to be on the same discussion point. I've been joking with some of the people that we do a lot of these PHA and LOPA studies with, and they were saying that doing a LOPA remote is even easier than doing a HAZOP remote, because a lot of times people don't necessarily know what's going on in the layer of protection analysis in person anyway. And so while that was a little bit funny, it is that's something where it might even be easier to track along remotely than the HAZOPs. And then what we do want to emphasize is that it's not just limited to functional safety activities. Um, we've been doing a lot of cybersecurity analysis remotely, in part before this happened, but especially now, and thinking about, a cybersecurity gap assessment, a vulnerability assessment, or a risk assessment. All of those can be conducted remotely. Some of the things to think about there are, getting the information, running the vulnerability scans, looking at ways of doing that remotely, or, providing resources for the on-site staff to actually run those scans, looking at, holding risk assessment sessions very much the same way. And so that's all things that exida has experience with. And if you have questions on, we're certainly happy to provide more guidance on how we've done that successfully. And then lastly, also for alarm management, a number of alarm management activities can be completed in the same way. So whether it's the alarm philosophy development or some of that initial training, or actually going through and doing the detailed alarm rationalization, those are also things that we can support remotely. So just to summarize what we looked at today, we went through and talked about why are HAZOP studies such an important part for both greenfield and brownfield sites. We talked about what are some of the best practices for conducting a remote HAZOP, and then we looked at what are the benefits of using this approach for a remote HAZOP, as well as other study techniques. So before jumping to the questions, I did see a couple start to come in during the presentation. We're just going to kind of quickly look at some of the other things that exida is doing to continue to support our customers' safety, cybersecurity, and alarm management needs, during this difficult time. And so we have kind of, as we talked about during this presentation, we've significantly improved our remote meeting capability, both for our end user consulting as well as for our certification. And we've actually developed a remote certification audit process. And a lot of customers, who really were pushing, who need to get certification done, are finding this to be a huge help. We've also had enhanced training options that we'll focus on in the next couple of slides. Namely, we are continuing to add more courses to our online self-paced, and we've actually built a live streaming room that includes a green screen, includes multiple video cameras and angles, so you can actually, really see the instructor and really get that in-person experience from our live online courses. And then we've also recently pushed out our personnel certifications for the CFSE and CACE to be offered and proctored completely online. So this is, something where, if you're working from home and you do have a little bit more time to start tackling some of these important training goals, we've done a lot to really, support that and give you the most comprehensive remote training experience. And so some of the courses that we have coming up that will be online live coming from the streaming room are shown on this screen. So we've got a mix of cybersecurity, alarm management, and functional safety courses. If you check your calendars out going to the June 9th, 10th week, I'll actually be teaching our CS102 our end user cybersecurity course from that live streaming room. So I'm really excited for the opportunity to present that course in that new format and look forward to kind of the good interaction that will come from that. And so don't be afraid to check out the website for all of the offered courses that we're doing online. And then another thing that we want to note is that these courses won't just be limited to US time zones. We do have instructors around the globe who do have remote capabilities. So if you're looking for a course and you don't see anything that fits with your schedule or your time frame, don't hesitate to reach out to us, ask us, and we can look at putting together some support for that. And then lastly, something that we're really putting a lot of emphasis now on is getting more of our courses to be listed for the online self-paced training. And so we've just recently gotten 2 more new courses online. For the first one is our FSC 212, an introduction to functional safety for software developers, as well as the process hazard analysis with the FACS tool. And so if you saw the Excellentia screenshots that we were looking at, that's actually what I was working through. And so this would be really geared to facilitators and scribes who are trying to understand and work with the Excellentia software. And then something that we are recording and in the process of getting ready to add to the self-paced would be the CS201 course, and that's our cyber course for software development. And then just the other one that I'll pull out and note is we do have the CS102 course offered online. And so if the live training dates don't work, we do have that pre-recorded, and so that is a course that you can walk through and do. And then whenever we do have students sign up for these courses, we'll pair them with the instructor, and that way if any questions come up or you just have something that you want to touch base on, that's something that we can help with. And then lastly, just to get all the latest information about exida, don't hesitate to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn. And now we've got about 15 minutes to go through and answer some questions. If you have any that you didn't ask and want to write them now, this is a great time to do that. So looking through, okay, so the first question was, when we talk about greenfield, brownfield, what are we talking about? So greenfield is what would be used to describe a new facility where it's going into a new site, everything is being built. And then brownfield would be looking at an existing facility. So maybe some sort of revalidation, or if there was an upgrade or something that was done to an existing facility. The next one was asking about C&E. Yes, sorry, that is cause and effects. I probably should write that one out and not fall into the trap of just using lots of acronyms. I know engineers tend to love those. Let's see. So this question is a best guess of the number of nodes that could be completed for an operational HAZOP in a day using virtual platform. It's a tough question to answer because it certainly depends on how large the nodes are, and that kind of falls into the facilitator and team's philosophy for HAZOPs. I've gotten through as many as probably 4 to 5 nodes in a day with relatively smaller nodes. So I would say in terms of the speed of the remote HAZOP, that it can actually be pretty comparable to a regular in-person HAZOP. So if you're thinking about how much time to assign for something, maybe just add a little bit of a buffer because sometimes it can be slightly slower online, but really understanding kind of how long it would typically take. You'll have a pretty good estimate of how much to assume for the web meeting. For this question, it was asking about what sort of remote technology protocol for the HAZOP team members. Just thinking about any sort of web meeting. So for example, we're using the GoToWebinar application. when we host web meetings, a lot of times we'll use the GoToMeeting. And so at exida, we have the licenses to use the software. So our clients, wouldn't need any additional software beyond that. They would just need to kind of check with their IT, make sure that they're able to run those meeting software. This next question is that it can be hard to identify who is talking during a remote HAZOP. For looking at any recommended method for it being clear what participants are speaking. So something that we do at the start of all of our remote sessions are that we have everyone, walk through and introduce themselves, similar to an in-person HAZOP. By doing that, it gives us a kind of a better idea of who's on the call for what discipline. And then depending on the meeting software that's used, sometimes it'll show the name of the participant that's speaking. That's something that the GoToMeeting application does that I find very helpful. The other thing that I would recommend is for the facilitator, and that kind of goes to the next question of how can the identify and draw quiet participants. What I would say is I would recommend kind of asking questions to a specific role by name, or if you know that someone may have that information, that you would, say, hey, Jack, for this instrumentation and control, how do you see it being implemented? And that's something where if you've got the right team with the knowledge and kind of only one participant per role, it's a lot easier to kind of have an understanding of who should be talking. Let's see, this question is about using Exlentia with 2 screens. I get a screen resolution problem. I don't know if that's common or not. I know if you try to share 2 screens in the same software sometimes, it does shrink both of them and makes them hard to see. We've actually developed a way to share 2 different full-size screens, and that way you don't get the screen resolution problems with Exlentia. So that's something that we've kind of found a really good way to work around that. In terms of remote preparation, the report prep time, that should be consistent with a remote or a traditional PHA. So this question was just looking at some of the experience with complex HAZOPs being conducted remotely, number of attendees, nodes, and time. So I can just say one of the weeks of remote HAZOPs that I was doing just recently, we had maybe 25 attendees from different locations around the globe, and in that week we got through a very complex system that had different vendors and things like that. So really, with the right team, it can be very similar for the timing of a traditional HAZOP. In terms of my personal preference between remote and on-site HAZOP, I would say before this, we did sometimes receive requests to do a remote HAZOP, and I was always strongly on the, we really need to go through and do it in person. Now, after going through and doing some remote HAZOPs, I'm starting to walk back from that and would not be as opposed or as hesitant to do a remote session in the future. I do always like being able to go and meet people in person. So that's something that I just personally enjoy getting to meet the team. But I think you can really do a lot of that remotely as well. So let's see, let's keep going. The scribe doesn't necessarily need to have a process safety background, but they need to be familiar with the method and really good at listening and following the conversation. So that's something that when exida would go in and do a HAZOP, we typically provide both the scribe and the facilitator, and that really helps us to be successful. Another thing is that the scribe really needs to be familiar with the process hazard analysis worksheet, the software being used. So for example, that would be why we often recommend the Exlentia tool, because when we go through and use that tool, we can be much more efficient and actually go through the meetings more quickly. So let's see. So this question is, who should be the leader of the HAZOP, customer, contractor, or ISA? So for that one, I don't know if ISA typically offers any sort of HAZOP facilitation. Typically, we would recommend having a third party, so that may be what you're referring as the contractor here. But basically, by having an independent party, it really allows you to kind of cut through some of the disagreements between, if there are multiple parties represented on the project or multiple different groups. So we've seen that, having exida come in as a third-party facilitator has been very successful. Let's see. The question kind of here is, if you, have a facilitator with two screens and not everyone in the meeting has two screens, can you just share one screen and the facilitator would switch off what screen is being shared? That is something that we've done before, and it is, that does work. But the drawback we've seen is that if people can't be looking at both the PNIDs and the worksheet, it does kind of cut down on the effectiveness a good bit. But that's something where it's certainly, we've worked with clients to have successful HAZOPs that way. We just haven't found that to be the best way to do it. So the question on this one is kind of thinking about, how can you have the same productivity if you're dealing remotely with different countries, time zones, and languages? So I think that's, a very a fair question to ask. What I would say is that even for an in-person HAZOP, if you have team members, coming in from those different countries, you would still have kind of any of the same language barriers. It's not something where understanding of the different languages that the teams are going to be using and kind of preparing for that. So having, maybe a facilitator with knowledge of the different languages, or kind of pairing up the right team balance to be able to talk in those different languages, that's something that we would recommend doing remote or in person. And then in terms of the productivity, it really then just comes down to doing, more in the preparation ahead of time, and making sure that you're able to keep everyone on the same page. So I think it does, provide some additional maybe difficulty to the facilitator, and maybe some additional difficulty to the participants. But we have seen that you can really maintain pretty similar productivity. Let's see. So for the training courses which need Excelentia, if you don't have the software, I believe you can get a trial license that would work with the course when you go through and do it. So that's something where I can certainly forward that to our Exida Academy, the kind of the people who run the training course. They may be able to answer that a little bit better. But I know that we have provided trial licenses.
Hi, that's right. For the self-paced courses, the Excelentia courses come with a 2-week trial period with Excelentia.
So let's see. This question is, what are our suggestions for software to perform the remote HAZOP? So typically what I would say is that we found Excelentia to be a very strong HAZOP tool, and having a strong HAZOP tool for the remote sessions is important, because the more that you can do on that one screen and that one tool, the more people are able to follow along. And so I do have some experience, but not nearly as much with some of the other common PHA facilitation tools. but I would say that my preference would be to use Excelentia. This is a question kind of on HAZOP philosophies that sometimes having a good scribe can be more important than the HAZOP leader. And actually, as someone who's both scribed and facilitated for HAZOPs, I think that that's a fair point to make, that sometimes having the right pairing of the scribe and the facilitator, or just having someone who's really good at tracking those notes can be just as important. So I certainly wouldn't disagree with that. This question is, does the scribe need to be in the same physical location as the chairman, or can the scribe be located remotely? We've done it both ways, but we've been able to have success even with a remote scribe and facilitator. So that is something that, depending on where the team is located, that can be done. We've got a couple questions on what programs we use to share two screens. So what we've actually done is we'll run parallel meetings using kind of diverse technology. And so that's something where if you're interested in doing a remote HAZOP and have some questions on it, we can kind of fill you in a little bit more details on how to do that. So the degree of inefficiency for remote HAZOP compared to kind of a traditional HAZOP, I would say it really does depend on the team. What we would say is, with the best practices that we've outlined, if you go through and follow those steps, that would be where we say you've done everything you can to minimize the potential distractions or additional inefficiency of the remote HAZOP. And so I would say, doing that, the degree of inefficiency is actually pretty minimal compared to an in-person HAZOP. But it is so dependent on the knowledge of the team and the skill of the facilitator that it might not be necessarily common or always possible to have the same efficiency. So it's just something where if you are working with a new team, you kind of are going to have to gauge what their pacing is. So for example, this question is asking about, if a whiteboard would be used in a HAZOP, are there options to explain to the team or how to show that? So there are a couple different ways that we've seen that and kind of use that as a benefit actually. So in our live streaming room, we actually have a camera with a whiteboard so that there's actually a view where you can go over and be looking at the facilitator drawing on the whiteboard just like they were in person. So that's something that, with that room, we're really happy to be able to offer that. What we've also done is, if we're not using the live streaming room, using a remote tablet, or even I've had to do it using just my mouse, you can draw on Paint, or a lot of meeting softwares actually have a whiteboard that you can share. So we've gone through and done that to kind of write out the same things. Another thing is, if you can kind of anticipate questions going ahead of time, you can maybe jot them out quickly and then take a picture. So we have seen ways to do that successfully. This question's about the risk ranking, doing it offline with the facilitator. So what I would say is, we always do the risk ranking online, whether it's an in-person HAZOP or remote HAZOP. I would agree with kind of the thought here that if you do it offline, a lot of times you miss the important discussions and that you may not have it ranked correctly. This question is sometimes, simulations of the process need to be done during the HAZOP. Is there a way to, do that and then still have that presented remotely? And that's a really good point. A lot of times there are other things that have to be gone through and looked at during the study. What I would say is, with a lot of the meeting softwares, you can actually give someone else the presenter rights. So if you did have a process engineer who was running that, we would allow them to be the presenter to show that if we needed to talk through it as a team. or used to look at kind of what the concerns there are or answer the additional questions. All right, so it is 10:59. I know that we're slowly losing people and that the time is almost out, but we do have 3 or 4 more questions. Let me just go through and answer those. So if you do have a question, don't be afraid to stay on the line. I'll go through and answer them. If not, thank you very much for joining. We really appreciated the attendance. Okay. So this question is, can Exlentia be also used on automation jobs and not just processed? So I would say the Exlentia tool is very versatile, and you can kind of configure it lots of different ways. So I'd like to kind of maybe get a bit of a better understanding of what's specifically meant by the automation jobs. But my gut reaction would be yes, that there are ways to use the software successfully for that. Oh, someone's asking, is there going to be a difference between session 1 and 2? The 2 sessions are going to be the same. So the intent is just that if people are in different time zones, that they can attend one of the 2 sessions. So then this question, any latest not successful experience? So I think there definitely can be times where it's trickier to do a remote HAZOP. I know what I would say is when I started doing them, um, I would certainly, and I think the team would be fatigued by the first 4 hours. And so if we started pushing much past that, we started to see decreases in efficiency. So it's not that we've only had positive experience with it, but I think over time, as we've implemented more of these techniques, we've certainly seen improvements in efficiency. Another thing to note is that there is always some time spent troubleshooting, making sure that everyone's properly in the meetings in the beginning. And that is something that maybe is some additional time that typically stays. Then the last question is, are we preparing the noted PNIDs prior to the meeting? Yes, that's something that we will a lot of times do for these remote sessions. We'll get the drawing package ahead of time to kind of estimate, the number of meeting days, and then we'll provide, based on our noting guidelines, what we would recommend. We'll review with the process engineers, and if everyone agrees that those are, the right places to split the nodes, then we'll do that ahead of time, and that way everyone can look at the noted PNIDs for the meeting. Alrighty, well, we ran just a little bit over time on questions, but thank you guys for asking all of those great questions. If there were a lot of them coming in, so if I missed yours, please don't hesitate to email me. My email is on the slide, and so I'm happy to talk more with anyone if you do have specific questions. Thank you, stay safe, keep following social distancing and all of that. But we really appreciate your attendance today and look forward to staying in touch.